I never imagined that buying my first condo in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, would turn into a 4-year war that would eventually lead to me owning the property of my worst enemy. But that's exactly what happened when I crossed paths with Linda Patterson, the self-appointed queen of the Suncrest Heights Homeowners Association. My name is Yates Vaughn, and I was 28 years old when I bought my modest 2-bedroom condo on the 3rd floor of a 12-story building in 2019. I had just landed a solid job as a software engineer at a tech startup, and I was ready to stop throwing money away on rent. The building was decent, built in the 80s, with a community pool, a small gym, and parking garage. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. At least I thought it was mine until I met Linda 3 days after moving in. I was carrying boxes from my truck when this woman in her early 50s, with an aggressively highlighted blonde bob and the kind of yoga pants that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," approached me with a clipboard. Her oversized sunglasses were perched on her head despite it being 7 in the evening, and she wore a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be the new owner of Unit 312, she said, not as a question but as an accusation. "I'm Linda Patterson, president of the HOA board. We need to discuss several violations I've already noticed." I set down the box I was carrying and wiped sweat from my forehead. "Violations? I just moved in today." She clicked her pen with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed this. "Your moving truck has been parked in the loading zone for over 3 hours. The maximum allowed time is 2 hours. That's a $50 fine. Also, I noticed you have a doormat outside your unit. All doormats must be approved by the HOA board and cannot exceed 18 inches by 24 inches. Yours appears to be oversized." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. It never came. "You're joking, right?" "The HOA covenants are no joke, Mr. Vaughn. I expect compliance within 48 hours or the fines will increase." She thrust a packet of papers at me, easily 100 pages thick. "This is your copy of our CC and Articles. I suggest you read them thoroughly. Welcome to Suncrest Heights." She walked away before I could respond, her athletic shoes squeaking against the concrete. I looked down at the doormat I had just placed outside my door that morning. It was a simple black mat that said "Welcome" in gray letters. It looked exactly like every other doormat in the hallway. That was my introduction to Linda Patterson, and it should have been a warning sign for what was coming. But I was young and stubborn, and I had just bought my first property. I wasn't about to let some busybody push me around over a doormat. I spent that evening unpacking and forgot about Linda entirely, until 2 days later, when I found a formal violation notice taped to my door. The paper was printed on official HOA letterhead and detailed 3 violations: the moving truck overstay, the non-compliant doormat, and apparently I had placed my trash bag in the wrong type of trash can. According to the notice, all trash bags must be placed in HOA-approved containers, and personal trash cans visible in common areas were prohibited. The total fines came to $125. I was furious. I had followed every rule I knew about. The trash situation was particularly galling because there were no HOA-provided trash cans on my floor. I had no choice but to carry my trash bag to the chute at the end of the hall. How was I supposed to transport trash without it being visible? I called the HOA management number listed on the notice and got voicemail. I left a polite but firm message explaining that I was new, that I hadn't been given adequate notice about these rules, and that I wanted to contest the fines. 3 days passed without a response. Then I received another notice. Because I hadn't paid the fines within 72 hours, they had now increased by 50%. I now owed $187.50. This was insane. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which according to the posted schedule in the lobby, was the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening in the community room. I marked it on my calendar and spent the weekend actually reading through the CC and articles that Linda had given me. What I found was disturbing. The document was a maze of contradictory rules, many of which seemed designed more to generate fines than to maintain community standards. For example, Section 4.2.7 stated that all residents must maintain their balconies in a neat and orderly fashion with no visible storage items. But Section 8.1.3 stated that all seasonal items like bicycles and sporting equipment must be stored on balconies and not in common areas. These two rules were literally impossible to follow simultaneously if you owned a bicycle. I highlighted dozens of these contradictions and prepared a list of questions for the board meeting. I also did some research on HOA law in Arizona and discovered that the board had a legal obligation to provide residents with reasonable notice before imposing fines, and that residents had the right to a hearing. None of that had happened in my case. Tuesday evening arrived, and I walked into the community room to find 6 other people already seated. Linda sat at a folding table at the front of the room with 2 other board members. A tired-looking man in his 60s who was introduced as the treasurer, Gerald, and a woman named Marcia who served as secretary. There were 3 other residents in attendance, all of whom looked like they had given up on life. Linda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her knuckles on the table. We have several items on the agenda tonight. First, we need to discuss the ongoing violations in Units 312, 708, and 914. My unit was 312. I raised my hand. I'm here about that. I received violation notices, but I wasn't given proper notice or an opportunity for a hearing as required by Arizona state law. Linda looked at me like I had just spit on her shoes. Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse for breaking them, Mr. Vaughn. The CC and articles are provided to all new owners. You signed a document at closing acknowledging receipt. I did receive them, but I'm contesting the violations themselves. The moving truck situation was outside my control because the elevator was broken, which delayed our move. The doormat is the same size as every other doormat in the building, and there are no HOA-provided trash cans on my floor, so I had no alternative but to carry my trash the way I did. Gerald, the treasurer, shifted uncomfortably. She has a point about the trash cans, Linda. We haven't installed those yet on the upper floors. Linda shot him a look that could have stripped paint. The rule is clear. Trash must be in approved containers. If Mr. Vaughn had questions, he should have contacted the board before violating the rules. I tried to call, I said, keeping my voice level. I left a message 3 days ago. No one returned my call. I've been very busy, Linda snapped. Managing this community is a full-time job and I'm a volunteer. The least residents can do is follow simple rules. I pulled out my annotated copy of the CC and articles. I've been reading through these, and I found numerous contradictions. For example, Section 4.2.7 and Section 8.1.3 directly contradict each other regarding balcony storage. Linda's face was turning red. Those sections apply to different situations. How? They both address the same subject matter. How is a resident supposed to know which one to follow? Common sense, Linda said flatly. If you have questions, you ask the board. I did ask. You didn't respond. The other residents in the room were watching this exchange with wide eyes, like they were witnessing someone actually stand up to a dictator for the first time. One of them, An older woman actually whispered, "Good for you." Linda stood up abruptly. "This meeting is not a forum for you to argue about your violations, Mr. Vaughn. The fines stand. If you don't pay within 7 days, we'll place a lien on your property. That's all I have to say on the matter. Now, moving on to next month's budget." I sat through the rest of the meeting in stunned silence. A lien on my property over $187. For violations I had no reasonable way to avoid. This was beyond petty tyranny. This was theft. After the meeting ended, Gerald approached me quietly. "Listen, kid," he said in a low voice. "Just pay the fines. It's not worth fighting her. Linda has been on this board for 12 years. She always wins." "That's not right," I said. "No, it's not, but it's reality. Several owners have tried to fight her over the years. She makes their lives miserable until they either give up or sell. One guy tried to run for the board against her. She found violations for every single thing he did. He ended up with over $5,000 in fines and had to sell his unit just to get out from under it." "That's illegal," I said. Gerald shrugged sadly. "Probably, but HOA law is complicated and lawyers are expensive. Most people can't afford to fight. Linda knows that." I went home that night and did more research. Gerald was right that HOA law was complicated, but Arizona actually had some pretty strong protections for homeowners. The problem was that enforcing those protections required either filing a complaint with the state or hiring a lawyer to take the HOA to court. Both options were expensive and time-consuming, but I was angry and I was stubborn, and I had a little bit of money saved up. More importantly, I had something Linda didn't know about: a brother who was a lawyer. Not an HOA lawyer, but he had friends who were. I called my brother Marcus that night and explained the situation. He listened quietly and then said, "She placed a lien on your property over less than $200 in contested fines. That's absurd. Let me make some calls." 2 days later, Marcus connected me with an attorney named Rachel who specialized in HOA disputes. We had a consultation over the phone, and I explained everything that had happened. Rachel listened and then laughed, not unkindly. "Your HOA president is an idiot," she said. She violated about a dozen different provisions of Arizona HOA law. The failure to provide proper notice, the failure to offer a hearing, the contradictory rules, and the immediate threat of a lien all give us plenty to work with. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to send the board a formal demand letter requiring them to rescind the fines and to provide proper notice and hearing procedures going forward. This will cost you about $500. If they ignore it, we can file a lawsuit, but I don't think it will come to that. Most HOA boards cave when they realize they're actually going to have to defend their actions. I hired Rachel immediately. 3 days later, she sent a formal demand letter to the HOA board via certified mail. The letter was a thing of beauty, clearly laying out every legal violation Linda had committed and demanding that the fines be rescinded within 10 days. It also put the board on notice that any retaliation against me would result in immediate legal action. Linda's response arrived 5 days later, not from her but from the HOA's attorney. The letter was much more measured in tone and stated that the board would be willing to waive the fines as a one-time courtesy, but that I was expected to comply with all rules going forward. There was no admission of wrongdoing, but I didn't care. I had one round won. I should have known that Linda wouldn't let it go that easily. Over the next 6 months, I received violation notices at least twice a week. My car was parked slightly over the line in my assigned spot. My balcony chair was the wrong color. I had left my condo at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday wearing gym clothes, which apparently violated a rule about wearing appropriate attire in common areas. That last one was so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud when I read it. I forwarded every single violation notice to Rachel, who sent increasingly stern letters to the HOA's attorney. Most of the violations were rescinded, but new ones appeared just as quickly. It was clear that Linda was watching me, looking for any excuse to fine me. The stress was affecting my work and my mental health. I started avoiding common areas entirely, taking the stairs instead of the elevator just to minimize any chance of running into Linda. Then things escalated in a way I never expected. In March of 2020, just as the pandemic was beginning to shut everything down, I received a notice that the HOA was implementing new rules regarding noise complaints. According to the new rule, any noise complaint would result in an automatic $250 fine, with no warning and no hearing. The rule was ostensibly about preventing disturbances during the pandemic when everyone was home, but I knew it was targeted at me. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I received a violation notice for a noise complaint. According to the notice, my neighbor had complained about loud music at 10:30 on a Saturday night. I had been out of town that entire weekend visiting my parents in Flagstaff. I had receipts, photos, and my parents as witnesses. The complaint was completely fabricated. I provided all of this evidence to Rachel, who demanded an immediate hearing. The hearing was held via Zoom due to pandemic restrictions, and it was clear from the start that it was a sham. Linda had screenshots of text messages from my neighbor allegedly complaining about noise, but when Rachel asked to question the neighbor, Linda claimed they didn't want to participate because of privacy concerns. "That's convenient," Rachel said dryly. "My client was not even in the state when this alleged violation occurred. We have extensive proof of this. The complaint was filed, and we have no reason to doubt its validity," Linda said. Her Zoom background showed her sitting in what looked like a home office with inspirational posters about leadership. "The fine stands." Rachel's voice took on a sharp edge. "Miss Patterson, are you aware that filing false violation notices constitutes fraud? And that using the HOA's authority to harass a resident is a violation of Arizona law?" "I resent that accusation," Linda said, but I could see a flicker of nervousness in her eyes. "We're simply enforcing the rules." The hearing ended with the fine being upheld. Rachel immediately filed a lawsuit against the HOA in Maricopa County Superior Court, alleging harassment, fraud, and violations of Arizona's HOA statutes. The lawsuit sought to have the fine rescinded, to have my attorney's fees paid by the HOA, and to have Linda removed from the board. This was no longer about the money. This was about principle. And apparently, it was also about revenge, because Linda's next move was nuclear. In June of 2020, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney stating that I owed over $8,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees. The letter included a detailed accounting of every violation notice I had received over the past year, including all of the ones that had been rescinded. According to the letter, even though the individual fines had been waived, the HOA was entitled to charge me for the administrative costs of processing each violation, and those costs had been accumulating with interest. Rachel reviewed the letter and told me it was complete nonsense. "This is clearly retaliatory," she said. "They're trying to bury you in debt to force you to drop the lawsuit. We'll fight this, but I need you to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." She was right. In August, the HOA filed a lien against my property for the $8,000. In September, they filed for foreclosure. They were actually trying to take my home over fabricated fines. I was terrified. I had put every penny I had into buying this condo, and now I was facing the possibility of losing it. Rachel assured me that we had a strong case and that no judge would allow this foreclosure to proceed, but the legal process was slow. Our trial date wasn't scheduled until January of 2021, and in the meantime, the foreclosure process was moving forward. I spent my savings on legal fees. I stopped going out, stopped doing anything that cost money. Every penny went to fighting Linda and the HOA. My friends and family were supportive, but they didn't really understand how this could be happening. "Can't you just pay the fines and move?" my mother asked. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money anymore, that if I gave in now, Linda would never stop, and that other residents would continue to be victimized. But I could hear the doubt in her voice. The trial in January 2021 was held remotely due to ongoing pandemic restrictions. Rachel presented our case methodically, showing the judge the pattern of harassment, the fabricated violations, the contradictory rules, and the clear retaliation for my having hired an attorney. She presented my evidence that I was out of town during the alleged noise complaint. She showed the judge how the HOA had attempted to collect administrative fees for violations that had been rescinded. The HOA's attorney, a nervous man named David, who clearly knew his case was weak, tried to argue that the board had the authority to enforce rules and collect fees as they saw fit. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Harriet Stone, listened patiently and then asked a simple question. "Counselor, does your client have any actual evidence that Mr. Vaughn committed the violations he was cited for?" David shuffled papers. "The board received complaints, Your Honor." "From whom?" "The complaints were filed confidentially to protect the privacy of other residents." Judge Stone leaned forward, her face filling the Zoom screen. "So you're telling me that your board has placed a lien and initiated foreclosure proceedings against Mr. Vaughn based on anonymous complaints with no verification whatsoever?" "The board has the discretion to evaluate complaints and issue fines as appropriate," David said weakly. "The board's discretion is not unlimited," Judge Stone said sharply. "It is constrained by law and by basic principles of fairness. Mr. Vaughn has presented substantial evidence that he was not even present when at least one alleged violation occurred. Your client has presented nothing but conjecture and what appears to be a vendetta. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. All fines are hereby rescinded. The lien is dissolved. The foreclosure proceedings are dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the HOA will pay Mr. Vaughn's attorney's fees in full. Do I make myself clear?" David nodded miserably. "Yes, Your Honor." I nearly cried with relief. Rachel sent me a congratulatory email and an invoice for $32,000 in attorney's fees, which the HOA was now obligated to pay. I had won, but Linda wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. 2 weeks after the judgment, I received a notice that my monthly HOA dues were increasing from $250 per month to $600 per month. The notice stated that the increase was necessary to cover the legal fees the HOA had been ordered to pay and other increased operating costs. The increase was being applied to all units equally, which meant it was technically legal, even though everyone knew why it was really happening. I went door to door in my building talking to neighbors and explaining what had happened. Most people were sympathetic but resigned. "That's just Linda," one man told me. "She's been pulling this stuff for years. It's easier to just go along." But a few residents were angry. A woman named Patricia on the 5th floor had been fighting her own battle with Linda over a dispute about parking spaces. A young couple on the 8th floor, newly married, had received thousands of dollars in fines for having a small garden on their balcony. Together, the five of us formed a coalition. We spent March and April of 2021 organizing. We went door to door, held Zoom meetings, and created a Facebook group for residents to share their experiences with the board. What we discovered was shocking. Over the past 10 years, Linda had issued over $200,000 in fines to various residents. Some people had paid them without question. Others had fought and either won or given up. But the sheer scale of it was staggering. We also discovered something interesting. Linda herself was behind on her HOA dues. According to the HOA's financial records, which we obtained through a formal records request, Linda hadn't paid her monthly dues in over 18 months. She owed nearly $9,000, more than I had supposedly owed at the peak of my dispute. When we raised this at the April board meeting, Linda had an excuse ready. "I've been working tirelessly for this community as a volunteer," she said. "The board agreed to waive my dues in recognition of my service." "Show us the board minutes where that was voted on," Patricia demanded. Linda's face went tight. "It was discussed in executive session." "Executive sessions are for legal matters and personnel issues," I said. I had done my research. Waiving board members' dues is not an appropriate topic for executive session. That's a financial matter that requires a vote in open session. Gerald, the treasurer, looked uncomfortable. "Linda, I don't remember us voting on that." "Of course we did," Linda snapped. "You just don't remember. You don't remember a lot of things, Gerald." The meeting devolved into chaos. Marcia, the secretary, claimed she couldn't find any minutes reflecting such a vote. Gerald said he wanted to see records of all board votes over the past 2 years. Linda tried to shut down the discussion, but residents were shouting questions. Finally, Linda stormed out of the meeting entirely, leaving Gerald and Marcia sitting at the table looking shell-shocked. The next day, Patricia filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs in the state. The complaint alleged that Linda had misused her position for personal gain by waiving her own dues without proper authorization, and that she had systematically abused residents through improper fines. The investigation would take months, but it was a start. Linda's response was to double down. In May, she issued new violation notices to everyone in our coalition. My notice claimed I had failed to re-register my vehicle with the HOA, a requirement I had never been told about. Patricia got cited for having a wreath on her door that was allegedly not in keeping with community standards. The young couple got cited for walking their dog in the courtyard during prohibited hours. We fought every single violation through proper channels, documenting everything. Rachel continued to represent me, now working almost pro bono because she was fascinated by how brazen Linda had become. "I've seen a lot of HOA disputes," she told me, "but I've never seen a board president this willing to break the law. She either doesn't understand the consequences or doesn't care." In August of 2021, the investigation by the Department of Real Estate concluded. The findings were damning. Linda had indeed waived her own dues without proper authorization. She had also failed to maintain proper financial records, had issued fines without following proper procedures, and had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, including meals, gas, and even a weekend trip to Sedona that she claimed was for HOA business, but for which she could provide no supporting documentation. The department ordered the HOA to remove Linda from the board immediately, to conduct a full financial audit, and to implement proper procedures for all future fines and violations. They also assessed penalties against the HOA totaling $15,000. We thought we had won. We celebrated. Patricia brought champagne to my condo, and we toasted to finally being free of Linda's tyranny. But we had underestimated how deep Linda's obsession went. Linda refused to step down from the board. She claimed that the department had no authority over her, and that only the HOA membership could remove her. Technically, she was partially right. Arizona law allows HOA members to remove board members through a recall vote, and the department couldn't physically force her out. So we organized a recall election. Under the HOA's bylaws, we needed signatures from 25% of the ownership to trigger a recall vote. We had 300 units in the building, which meant we needed 75 signatures. We gathered them in less than a week. The recall vote was scheduled for October 15, 2021. We campaigned hard, making sure every owner knew what was at stake. Linda fought back by sending letters to every unit claiming that the recall was being organized by troublemakers who wanted to destroy the community. She held her own meetings where she painted herself as a victim of persecution. Some residents actually believed her. The vote was close. Linda was recalled by a vote of 162 to 121. She had lost, but it wasn't the landslide we had hoped for. She gave a tearful speech at the meeting announcing the results, claiming that she had devoted 12 years of her life to serving the community, and that this was the thanks she got. Some people actually felt sorry for her. I didn't. I had seen too much. I knew what she was capable of. A new board was elected, with Patricia as president, Gerald staying on as treasurer, and 3 new members including myself. We immediately began the process of reviewing all the rules, rescinding improper fines, and trying to repair the damage Linda had done to the community's finances and reputation. That should have been the end of the story. But Linda's final act of revenge was still to come. In December of 2021, I received a notice that Linda had filed a lawsuit against me personally for defamation. She claimed that I had spread false information about her to other residents and to the Department of Real Estate, and that this had damaged her reputation. She was seeking $100,000 in damages. Rachel reviewed the lawsuit and told me it was frivolous. "Everything you said about her was true and documented," she explained. "Truth is an absolute defense to defamation. This will get thrown out, but you'll need to defend yourself, which means more legal fees." I was exhausted. I had been fighting Linda for over 2 years. I had spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees. I just wanted it to be over. The defamation case dragged on through 2022. Linda represented herself, which meant that every filing was a disorganized mess of legal terms she clearly didn't understand and emotional rants about how I had ruined her life. The judge repeatedly warned her about proper procedures, but she didn't seem to care. She used the lawsuit as a platform to air every grievance she had. In June of 2022, the judge finally dismissed the case with prejudice, ruling that Linda had failed to present any evidence of actual defamation. The judge also sanctioned Linda for filing a frivolous lawsuit, ordering her to pay $5,000 to cover my legal costs. Linda never paid. Rachel obtained a judgment and tried to collect, but Linda claimed she had no assets. She was unemployed, living off savings and her late husband's pension. There was nothing to collect. But here's where the story takes its final twist. As the new HOA board treasurer, I had access to all the financial records. In early 2023, while reviewing years of old records as part of our cleanup effort, I noticed something strange. Linda had taken out multiple special assessments over the years for building improvements that never seemed to materialize. There was a $50,000 assessment for roof repairs in 2018, a $30,000 assessment for pool renovations in 2019, a $20,000 assessment for parking lot resurfacing in 2020, None of those projects had been completed. I checked with the building manager, with contractors, with city permits. No work had been done, but the money had been collected from all the residents and deposited into the HOA's accounts. I traced the money through the bank records. The funds had been transferred to various accounts, and then the trail went cold. But there were a few checks written to companies that supposedly did work for the HOA. I looked up those companies. They were all registered to the same person, Linda Patterson. She had created shell companies, awarded them contracts from the HOA, and paid herself over $200,000 over a period of 5 years. It was fraud on a massive scale. I took the evidence to Rachel, who took it to the police. The Phoenix Police Department opened an investigation. In July of 2023, Linda was arrested and charged with fraud, theft, and embezzlement. The charges involved not just the fake contracts, but also the personal expenses she had charged to the HOA, the waived dues, and various other financial improprieties. The case went to trial in March of 2024. I testified about discovering the financial records. Other residents testified about the fines and harassment. The prosecution laid out a clear pattern of Linda using her position to enrich herself while bullying anyone who questioned her. Linda represented herself at trial, which was a mistake. She rambled, made emotional appeals, and at one point actually claimed that she deserved the money because of all the hard work she had done for the community. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. In May of 2024, Linda was sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, which now totaled nearly $250,000 with interest and penalties. But the story doesn't end there, because Linda had one final surprise in store. As part of the restitution process, the court ordered Linda's assets to be sold to pay back the HOA. She had few assets. She rented rather than owned her condo at Suncrest Heights, having sold her own unit years earlier, apparently to help fund her lifestyle. She had a car worth maybe $10,000. She had some jewelry and household goods. But the total value was maybe $20,000, nowhere near what she owed. However, the records showed that Linda did own one property. A small one-bedroom condo in a different complex across town, in a building called Desert Vista. She had bought it in 2017 as an investment property and had been renting it out. The condo was ordered to be sold at a sheriff's sale to satisfy the judgment. Sheriff sales are public auctions where properties are sold to the highest bidder to pay off debts. They're usually attended by investors looking for deals, because properties often sell for less than market value. The sale was scheduled for August 12, 2024. I wasn't planning to go. I had no interest in owning another property, especially not one connected to Linda. But Patricia called me the week before. "You should go to that sale," she said. "Why would I do that?" "Because we're all going. We're going to make sure that property sells for every penny it's worth. Linda's not going to get away with having some investor buddy buy it cheap and flip it for a profit. We're going to bid that thing up." I laughed, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea. The HOA would get whatever the property sold for. The higher the price, the more money we'd recover. And there was a certain poetic justice in showing up to watch Linda's last asset get stripped away. The sheriff's sale was held on the courthouse steps in downtown Phoenix at 10 in the morning. It was already 95 degrees. There were about 20 people there, a mix of investors with clipboards and our group from Suncrest Heights. I recognized a few of the investors as regulars who attended these sales looking for deals. The auctioneer, a bored-looking county official, read the property description. 1 bedroom, 1 bath condo approximately 700 square feet, Desert Vista Complex, Unit 206. Minimum bid was $100,000, which represented what Linda owed on the mortgage plus some of the judgment. The bidding started. An investor opened at $100,000. Patricia immediately countered with $105,000. Another investor went to $110,000. I raised my hand and said $115,000. The other investors looked at us with confusion. Sheriff sales usually didn't have this much competition. Properties typically sold close to the minimum bid because of the risks involved. You couldn't inspect the property beforehand, and you took it as is with any problems it might have. But we kept bidding. Every time an investor made a bid, one of us would counter. The price climbed to $130,000, then $140,000, then $150,000. The investors started dropping out, clearly realizing that something weird was going on and they weren't going to get the deal they wanted. Finally, we were down to one investor, a guy in his 40s wearing a polo shirt and sunglasses. He bid $160,000. I could see him calculating in his head whether it was still worth it. The market value for units in Desert Vista was probably around $200,000. So at $160,000 he'd still make a profit if he fixed it up and resold it. Patricia looked at me. I looked at the other members of our group. We had agreed beforehand that we'd pool our resources if necessary to make sure the property sold for at least $150,000. We were already above that, but I was angry. I was thinking about all the stress Linda had put me through, the sleepless nights, the money I had spent on lawyers, the 2 years of my life consumed by this fight. And I was thinking about all the other residents she had victimized, people who had paid thousands in bogus fines because they didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. I raised my hand. $170,000. The investor looked at me, shook his head, and walked away. The auctioneer called for any other bids. None came. Sold to bidder number 23 for $170,000. Bidder number 23 was me. I had just bought Linda Patterson's condo. My friends stared at me. "What are you going to do with it?" Patricia asked. "I have no idea," I admitted. I hadn't really thought this through. I had just been caught up in the moment, in the satisfaction of taking something from Linda the way she had tried to take everything from me. Over the next month, I completed the purchase process. Sheriff sales require cash payment within a short time frame, so I had to scramble to get financing. I took out a personal loan, borrowed some money from my parents, and cleaned out what was left of my savings. When the dust settled, I owned a one-bedroom condo in Desert Vista. The tenant, a quiet young woman named Sophie who worked as a nurse, had been month to month on her lease. She was understandably nervous when I contacted her to introduce myself as the new owner. I assured her that nothing would change, that I had no plans to raise her rent, and that she was welcome to stay as long as she wanted. She seemed relieved. I went to inspect the property for the first time in September 2024. It was a clean, simple unit on the second floor of a 3-story building. The complex was older but well-maintained, with mature landscaping and a large pool area. It was nothing fancy, but it was pleasant. What struck me as I walked through the empty hallway was how normal it felt. There were no violation notices taped to doors, no intimidating HOA rules posted everywhere. The other residents I saw smiled and said hello. The HOA board here was apparently functional and reasonable. They maintained the property, enforced basic rules about noise and cleanliness, and otherwise left people alone. This was what an HOA was supposed to be. Not a tool for petty tyrants to exercise power and extract money, but a simple mechanism for managing shared property and maintaining community standards. I thought about Linda, sitting in prison, probably still convinced that she had been right and that everyone else was wrong. Some people never learn. They never understand that positions of authority are about service, not power. That rules exist to help communities function, not to control and punish people. The restitution from the sale of Linda's condo, plus the liquidation of her other assets, brought the total recovered to about $190,000. It wasn't the full amount she had stolen, but it was substantial. The HOA board voted to use the money to make actual improvements to Suncrest Heights, the improvements that Linda had pretended to make years earlier. We fixed the roof, renovated the pool, and resurfaced the parking lot. We also hired a professional management company to handle day-to-day operations, taking the burden off volunteer board members and ensuring proper procedures were followed. The building felt different after that. People were friendlier. There was less tension. New residents moved in and were welcomed without being ambushed by violation notices. The monthly HOA meetings became boring affairs focused on mundane topics like landscaping contracts and insurance policies, exactly as they should be. As for Desert Vista, I kept the property as a rental. Sophie stayed on as a tenant, paying rent consistently and taking good care of the place. The rental income covered the loan payments with a little left over. It turned out to be a decent investment, though that was never really the point. The point was justice. Or maybe it was poetry. I'm not entirely sure. All I know is that Linda Patterson tried to take my home through foreclosure over fabricated fines, and in the end, I own her home instead. She tried to destroy me, and she destroyed herself. I visited Linda once in early 2025 at the state prison in Perryville where she was serving her sentence. I'm not sure why I went. Curiosity, maybe, or a need for closure. She agreed to see me, which surprised me. We sat across from each other in the visiting room, separated by a plexiglass barrier. Linda looked older, smaller somehow. Prison had stripped away the aggressive confidence she always projected. Her hair, no longer highlighted, was mostly gray. She wore the standard prison uniform and no makeup. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I wanted to see you," I said. "I wanted to understand why you did all of this." She laughed, a bitter sound. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I spent 30 years as a secretary. I answered phones, filed papers, scheduled meetings for men who barely knew my name. When my husband died, I retired. I had nothing, no career, no purpose. Then I got elected to the HOA board, and suddenly I mattered. People had to listen to me. I had power. So you abused it." "I enforced the rules," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Someone had to maintain standards. You created rules specifically to fine people. You stole money. You tried to take my home. You fought back," she said. "No one was supposed to fight back." That was it, I realized. That was the core of it. Linda had spent years wielding power over people who couldn't or wouldn't fight back, and when someone finally did, her entire identity collapsed. She had escalated and escalated because she couldn't accept losing control. "I bought your condo," I told her. "At the sheriff's sale. I own it now." I expected anger or pain or some reaction. Instead, she just nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "You won. You got everything you wanted. I hope it makes you happy." "It's not about happiness," I said. "It's about accountability." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something human in her eyes. Regret, maybe, or exhaustion. "If I could go back," she said quietly, "I would have just let you have your doormat." That was the only thing approaching an apology I ever got from her. I left the prison feeling neither triumphant nor vindicated, just tired. The war was over and everyone had scars. Life went on. I stayed at Suncrest Heights, serving on the HOA board for 2 more years before stepping down to let fresh voices take over. The building continued to improve, both physically and in terms of community atmosphere. People actually wanted to live there now, and property values increased. I eventually started dating someone I met at a local coffee shop, a teacher named Rachel, no relation to my lawyer. We would joke about my HOA war stories, though she initially thought I was exaggerating until she met Patricia and the others and heard their versions. "You took on an entire HOA board and won," she said once. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," I admitted. I learned a lot from the experience. I learned that most people will accept injustice rather than fight, not because they're weak, but because fighting is expensive and exhausting, and there's no guarantee of winning. I learned that systems designed to serve communities can easily be corrupted by individuals who crave power. I learned that holding people accountable requires persistence and resources, and a little bit of luck. Most importantly, I learned that home is worth fighting for. Not just the physical structure, but the sense of safety and belonging that comes from knowing you can't be arbitrarily punished or pushed out by someone on a power trip. Sophie, my tenant at Desert Vista, ended up buying the condo from me in late 2025. She had saved up for a down payment and wanted to stop renting. I sold it to her at a fair price, actually slightly below market value, because she had been a good tenant and because the condo had already served its purpose for me. It wasn't about the investment anymore. With that money, I paid back my parents, paid off my loans, and finally rebuilt my savings account. I was back to where I should have been financially if I had never met Linda Patterson, minus a few years of stress and gray hairs. The last I heard, Linda was released from prison in early 2026 after serving about 2 years of her 5-year sentence, with the rest being parole and supervised release. She moved in with a sister somewhere in California. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I honestly didn't care anymore. She was no longer my problem. The HOA at Suncrest Heights continued to function smoothly under new leadership. The rules were simplified, procedures were clarified, and enforcement became fair and predictable. Fines were used sparingly and only for legitimate violations. No one was threatened with foreclosure over a doormat. Patricia and I remained friends. We would occasionally grab coffee and laugh about the absurdity of those years, though the laughter was always tinged with disbelief that it had actually happened. "We took down a corrupt HOA president," she said once. "That's got to be worth something." "It's worth living in peace," I said. And that was true. The greatest victory wasn't the legal judgments or the restitution, or even buying Linda's condo. The greatest victory was being able to come home at the end of the day without anxiety, without checking my door for violation notices, without worrying that some petty tyrant was watching and waiting to pounce on any minor infraction. I could put any doormat I wanted outside my door. I could park my car without measuring its distance from the parking line. I could play music at a reasonable volume on a Saturday night without fear of fabricated complaints. These small freedoms, which should be basic expectations of homeownership, had become precious because I knew what it was like to have them threatened. Looking back, I can see how easily it could have gone differently. If I hadn't had a brother who was a lawyer, if I hadn't been able to afford legal representation, if I had been less stubborn or more willing to just accept injustice, Linda would have won. I would have either paid thousands in bogus fines or been forced to sell my home. And she would have moved on to the next victim, secure in the knowledge that she was untouchable. But I did fight back, and I did win, and that made all the difference. Not just for me, but for everyone else in that building who had suffered under Linda's regime. We proved that HOA boards are not above the law, that residents have rights, and that bullies can be held accountable if enough people are willing to stand up. The story spread beyond Suncrest Heights. Local news outlets picked it up when Linda was convicted. I did a few interviews, always emphasizing the systemic issues rather than making it about personal revenge. The Arizona legislature even used our case as an example when they passed new laws strengthening homeowner protections and increasing oversight of HOA boards in 2025. So maybe some good came out of it all. Maybe Linda's tyranny and eventual downfall served as a warning to other HOA board members who might be tempted to abuse their authority. Maybe some residents in other communities saw our story and found the courage to fight back against their own HOA injustices. Or maybe not. Maybe the cycle continues elsewhere, with other Lindas wielding power over other homeowners, secure in the belief that no one will challenge them. I hope not, but I'm realistic enough to know that the problem is bigger than one person or one HOA. What I do know is that I'm proud of what we accomplished. We stood up to a bully. We exposed corruption. We held someone accountable for their crimes. We made our community better. Those aren't small things. And yes, there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that I own the property of someone who tried to take mine. It's petty, perhaps, but I'm human. When I signed the papers selling that condo to Sophie, I thought about how Linda had signed papers years earlier buying it as an investment, probably feeling clever and successful. She never imagined that her investment would be seized and sold to satisfy a judgment for crimes she hadn't yet committed, but was already planning. Life has a way of surprising us, for better and worse. My surprise was meeting Linda Patterson 3 days after buying my first home. Her surprise was that one of her victims actually fought back. We were both changed by the experience, though in very different ways. I'm writing this in early 2026, sitting on my balcony at Suncrest Heights, looking out over Phoenix. It's a beautiful evening, the temperature finally dropping below 90 as the sun sets. My doormat, the same welcome mat that started this whole mess, sits outside my door. My car is parked in my assigned spot, maybe an inch over the line. There's a potted plant on my balcony that may or may not comply with community standards, and I genuinely don't know or care. I'm home and I'm free, and that's what matters. The war is over. Justice, imperfect and incomplete but real nonetheless, was served. The bad guy went to jail. The good guys won. And somewhere in California, Linda Patterson is hopefully learning that power without accountability is temporary, that bullying has consequences, and that trying to take someone's home is a sure way to lose your own. That's the story of how an HOA Karen demanded compliance or foreclosure, and how I ended up buying her condo at a sheriff's sale. It's a strange story, an improbable story, but it's true. Every word of it. Welcome to the reality of homeowners associations in America. Welcome to my life from 2019 to 2026. Welcome to the most expensive doormat in history.